Hi everyone. This is going to be the start of Unit 3, Biological Basis of Behavior. This is the first unit where you're going to be taking unit notes on your own without the note guide. Please make sure that you write down Unit 3, Biological Basis of Behavior, and today's lesson, 3.1, Neural Processing. Along with today's objectives, students will be able to discuss neural communication by describing all essential parts and processing involved in sending neural messages. Information that is nice to know is in italicized lettering, so it's not something that you have to write down, but could be helpful to write down. Biological psychology is the study of behavior and how biology causes behavior. So they're going to look at things like what you see right here, which is the neuron, and how the neuron communicates and how that might affect your behavior. This chart right here could come in helpful or come in handy as we move forward. It's something that does appear on the AP exam from time to time. And what this chart does is explain exactly how the neuron transmits information. So in other words, how the neuron works within itself. There are three kinds of neurons, two that we focus mostly on, and that's sensory and motor. Sensory helps pass messages about senses, whereas motor helps pass messages about movement via the spinal cord and the brain. Resting potential. When a neurotransmitter is just resting, when it's not doing anything, the inside of the axon terminal is negative charge, and the outside of the axon terminal is positively charged. And that's what we would see happening right here in this chart. Once a neuron receives a message, then it has to start, or it goes into action potential. And this is where an electrical signal fires throughout the neuron. Think of it as dominoes falling. When this message fires, it doesn't turn the whole thing on all at once. It's almost like dominoes falling as it changes. How this works is we have electrically charged ions moving down the axon terminal, changing the charge as it goes from negative, positive, negative. So think again that dominoes falling. As the domino falls, it turns from negative to positive. And then if it were to sit there for a moment, it would eventually go back to negative where it should be. This is called depolarization. So depolarization is when we see it go from negative, positive, negative. That's this uptake on your chart when a neuron is in fact firing. After it's done firing, we see potassium come and move throughout the neuron, which helps turn the neuron back into a negative charge from a positive charge. A better way to visualize it is right here. So what we would see is the sodium coming in, this positive charge coming into the axon terminal. As it comes in, potassium pushes back out, returning the inside of the axon back to negative as the message continues to move down through the axon terminal. So it comes in as positive, sends it right back out, so it establishes back a negative, and then again just kind of keeps moving down. So some things to keep in mind when it comes to sending messages and how neurons transmit information. There's two types of transmits that we look at: excitatory, which is pushing the pushing the neuron's accelerator, so getting it to move, getting it to pass that message along, or inhibitory, which says like, hey, stop for a minute, we don't need to send this message. However, either way, it has to hit a certain intensity in order for the neuron to fire. The neuron's not just going to fire on its own. It has to hit a very specific intensity, and that's called the threshold. It's an all or nothing principle. Either the neuron fires or it doesn't fire. There's no in between. If you think of it like a big hug, when we have a really big hug with somebody, it actually causes more neurons to fire, which is how we know it's a big hug, versus if you have a little hug with somebody, then not as many neurons will fire, which is how you know it's a little hog. And we have Snoopy and Charlie Brown right here, and we have the whole Winnie the Pooh gang right over there. So this is the beginning of how one neuron would communicate with another neuron, or how do nerve cells communicate with one another? Well, they do that by passing a neurotransmitter, which we'll get to in a moment here. But I wanted to explain what it looks like. So here we have the action potential arriving. Right here inside of the vesicles, you will see these little dots. Those dots represent neurotransmitters. In between the sending neuron and the receiving neuron is a synaptic cleft, which it doesn't actually touch. It gets very close. The famous quote for this is, "It's like 80s elegant ladies air kissing, as to not muss up their makeup. Dendrites and axons don't quite touch." So that's why we see this gap in between the two there. When action potential gets fired, it hits the end and releases the neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters then float through and bind itself to the next neurotransmitter, or to the next neuron. If there's any neurotransmitters left, it's considered reuptake, where they're taken back into the sending neuron. So these messages that these neurons send through are considered neurotransmitters, and these are chemical messages that are sent throughout your neurons to pass a message along. You have two types of neurotransmitters. You have an agonist, which is similar to the neurotransmitter itself and actually ends up blocking and mimicking one neurotransmitter. So one example of a mimic would be the opiate drugs. When you take an opiate drug, it mimics the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And an antagonist actually blocks the neurotransmitter from functioning. So it totally blocks it. It doesn't just mimic it and pretend like it's a fake one. It completely put a cover over it, block it, so that a neurotransmitter can't quite get in. Off to the right here, you see some of the more famous neurotransmitters that you need to know. The first is acetylcholine, which ensures muscle motion, learning, and memory. If you don't have enough of it, it can lead to Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. And if you have too much of that, it can lead to schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease. Serotonin affects the mood, the hunger, sleep, and arousal. And if you have an undersupply of this, it can lead to depression, and some antidepressant drugs raise serotonin levels. Norepinephrine helps control alertness and arousal. Undersupply can depress the mood. GABA is an inhibitory, so this is what I was saying when you hit the brakes. An undersupply can lead to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And glutamate is the excitatory, so when I say hit the gas, that's glutamate, because oversupply can overestimate the brain producing migraines and seizures. When you see that no MSG, the reason why it's such a big deal is because of glutamate.